No Way Out. Chapter 1. The Standoff. Jack Reacher found himself on a back road in the middle of Kansas. Endless fields stretched out like a sea of corn and emptiness. He walked with no particular destination, hands in the pockets of his battered jacket, feeling the familiar weight of a country he knew better than most. Up ahead, the sound of an engine broke the silence of the afternoon. A truck. Reacher raised his thumb in the universal sign of someone looking for a ride, but his instincts, always sharp, told him something was off. The driver slowed, but not enough to stop. From inside the cab, a middle-aged man with cold, calculating eyes stared at Reacher. This wasn't a typical trucker. He was looking for something. Or someone. Reacher kept his gaze on the vehicle as it passed by. Odd. No other cars had come through for hours. A truck that didn't stop. A driver that watched him too closely. Reacher had a bad feeling in his gut, the kind that had kept him alive through more firefights than he cared to remember. Minutes later, another vehicle appeared. This time, it was a black van with tinted windows. It slowed down, and the passenger door swung open. A man with a deep scar across his face stepped out, pointing a gun directly at Reacher. "Get in the van," the man said, his voice flat, emotionless. Reacher stared at him, quickly calculating his options. He was good with guns, but he preferred to avoid them when possible, especially against someone who had no hesitation about pulling the trigger. But, of course, Reacher didn't take orders from anyone. He took a step forward, eyes locked on the scarred man. "I don't think so," Reacher said, his voice calm. The scarred man didn't flinch. It wasn't a suggestion. Reacher's eyes flicked to the driver of the van. Another man, just as dangerous looking, sat behind the wheel, his eyes on Reacher, his hand on something just out of sight. Reacher guessed it was another gun. This was not a random encounter. These men had been sent for him, but they didn't know Jack Reacher. In one fluid motion, Reacher lunged forward, grabbing the scarred man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The gun dropped to the ground as Reacher drove his elbow into the man's throat, sending him stumbling back. The driver reacted instantly, reaching for the weapon, but Reacher was faster. He yanked the door open and slammed the driver's head against the steering wheel. Seconds later, both men were down, unconscious. Reacher grabbed the gun from the ground, checked it, and then tossed it into the field. He didn't need it. He didn't need much, but he did need answers. He searched the van quickly, finding nothing but a map with a single location circled in red. A small town, about 20 miles from where he stood. Whoever these men were, they had come prepared. But Reacher was always ready. He started walking again, toward the town. Something was waiting for him there. Enjoying the suspense? Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe and share to see the mystery unravel. Chapter 2. The Warning. The town was smaller than Reacher had expected. A single road stretched through its heart, flanked by worn-out buildings that had seen better days. A gas station stood on one corner, its rusty sign squeaking in the wind, while a diner across the street looked like it hadn't had a customer in hours. The place felt empty, but Reacher's instincts told him otherwise. He had been in enough forgotten towns to know when something was off. He walked past the diner, his eyes scanning every detail. A shadow shifted inside. Someone was watching. His gut tightened, the same feeling he had when he knew trouble was coming. The kind of trouble that wasn't easily avoided. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air smelled of stale coffee and old grease. A woman behind the counter glanced up, her eyes widening slightly when she saw him. She quickly turned away, pretending to be busy with a pile of dishes. The only other customer was an old man hunched over a newspaper at the far end of the diner, but Reacher knew he wasn't the one to worry about. Reacher took a seat at the counter, facing the door. He always liked to see who was coming. The waitress came over, wiping her hands on a stained apron. She didn't say anything at first, just placed a cup of black coffee in front of him, like she knew that's what he'd want. "You're not from around here," she said finally, her voice low. Reacher nodded. "Just passing through." "Well, you might want to keep passing," she muttered, casting a quick glance toward the window. "This town, it's not what it seems." Reacher took a sip of the coffee, keeping his eyes on her. "What's going on?" She hesitated, then leaned in closer. "You don't want to know. Just get out while you can." Before Reacher could respond, the door swung open. Two men stepped inside, their eyes immediately locking onto him. They weren't locals. They had the look of hired muscle, clean-cut but dangerous. One of them reached into his jacket, revealing the edge of a gun holster. Reacher didn't move. He didn't need to. He could tell by the way they entered that they were here for him, and they weren't interested in talking. The taller of the two men walked over, towering above Reacher. "Time to go." Reacher calmly set his cup down. "I don't think so." The man smirked, pulling the gun halfway out of his jacket. "You sure about that?" Reacher glanced at the waitress, who was now frozen in place, her eyes wide with fear. Then he looked back at the men. "I'm sure." Before the men could react, Reacher grabbed the coffee cup and smashed it against his face, the porcelain shattering on impact. The man stumbled back, blood streaming from his nose, but Reacher didn't give him time to recover. He was up in a flash, delivering a powerful punch to the man's throat, dropping him to the floor gasping for air. The second man moved fast, pulling out his gun, but Reacher was faster. He kicked the stool into the man's legs, sending him crashing into a table. The gun skittered across the floor, and Reacher was on him, slamming him into the wall with enough force to rattle the windows. "Who sent you?" Reacher growled, his forearm pressing against the man's throat. The man gasped, struggling to speak. You don't know what you're dealing with. Try me." The man's eyes flicked toward the door. Reacher followed his gaze just in time to see a black SUV pull up outside, the same one from the map. Whoever was after him wasn't finished yet. Reacher let the men drop and walked to the door. The waitress was still frozen in shock, but Reacher knew she had been trying to help in her own way. "Thanks for the coffee," he said, his voice calm. He stepped outside into the fading sunlight, his eyes narrowing as the SUV's doors opened. Whatever this was, it was far from over. Can you feel the tension rising? Subscribe and share to follow Reacher's next move as danger closes in. Chapter 3. The Trap. Reacher stood still as the SUV's door swung open. Three men stepped out, dressed in suits, more polished than the goons inside the diner. Their demeanor screamed control, and Reacher knew instantly that these were the decision-makers. The muscle was just there to do the dirty work. The man in the middle had sharp, intelligent eyes. He looked like the kind of person who didn't raise his voice but never needed to. Power radiated from him, quiet and absolute. He didn't move toward Reacher, just stood by the SUV, assessing him like a predator deciding how much effort it would take to bring down its prey. "Jack Reacher," the man said, his voice calm and measured. "I've been looking for you." Reacher said nothing. He waited. The man smiled slightly, as if amused by the silence. "We can do this the easy way," the man continued, "or the hard way. But either way, you're coming with us." Reacher shifted his weight slightly, his stance casual but ready. "Why would I go with you?" The man glanced toward the diner, where the two men inside were still picking themselves up from the beating Reacher had given them. "Because the alternative isn't going to end well for anyone here. Especially not for the people in that diner." Reacher's eyes narrowed. He didn't like threats. Especially not against civilians. The man took a step closer, confident. "We know about your past, Reacher. About the things you've done. The people you've left behind. This time, you're not walking away." Reacher considered his options. He could take the three men in front of him, that much was clear. But if this guy was talking about going after people, civilians, it meant something bigger was in motion. He didn't like getting involved in other people's wars, but he wasn't going to stand by and let innocent lives be used as leverage. He needed more information. "Who's pulling the strings?" Reacher asked, his voice cold. "Who wants me bad enough to send a cleanup crew like this?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "All in good time. Right now, all you need to know is that your time on the run is over." The last word barely left his lips before Reacher moved. Fast. One hand shot out, grabbing the nearest man's wrist and twisting it hard, sending the gun clattering to the ground. In the same motion, Reacher slammed his elbow into the second man's jaw, knocking him unconscious before he even hit the ground. The leader didn't flinch. He pulled a gun from his jacket, aiming it at Reacher's chest. "You don't want to do this." Reacher smiled grimly. "I already have." Without hesitation, he kicked the fallen gun into the man's hand, distracting him for a split second. That was all Reacher needed. He stepped forward, grabbed the man's wrist, and wrenched the gun away. A quick punch to the throat dropped the man to his knees, gasping for breath. Reacher stood over him. "You've got one more chance to tell me who sent you." The man choked out a laugh, even as he struggled to breathe. "It's too late, Reacher. You're already in it." Reacher's eyes darkened. "In what?" The man's lips twisted into a bloody grin. "The trap." Before Reacher could respond, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. He turned to see 3 more black SUVs speeding toward the diner, dust kicking up behind them. The men weren't alone. They had backup, lots of it. Reacher glanced at the vehicles closing in, then down at the man on the ground. "It's your funeral," Reacher muttered, before turning and running toward the side of the diner. He wasn't going to get boxed in. Not today. He slipped behind the building just as the SUVs skidded to a stop in front of the diner. He needed a way out, and fast. The town's narrow alleys and empty streets wouldn't give him much cover, but he had no intention of sticking around for a firefight. He spotted a delivery truck parked behind the diner, keys still in the ignition. Perfect. Reacher climbed in, started the engine, and pulled out just as the first shots rang out behind him. As he sped away, he knew one thing for sure: whoever these people were, they had planned this down to the last detail. They knew his moves, anticipated his responses. But Jack Reacher wasn't going down that easily. Ready for more? Subscribe and share if you want to see how Reacher handles this ambush. Chapter 4. The Pursuit. Reacher drove fast, the truck's engine roaring as he tore down the narrow country road. Behind him, the SUVs were closing in. Whoever was after him had resources, manpower, and they weren't going to stop until they had him. But they underestimated him, like most people did. He kept his eyes on the road, scanning for his next move. The truck wasn't built for speed, but it had size, and Reacher could use that to his advantage. Up ahead, the road curved sharply, with thick woods on either side. Perfect. He pressed down on the gas, aiming for the bend. He could hear the SUVs gaining on him, their tires screeching as they pushed their vehicles to the limit. Reacher kept the truck steady, waiting for just the right moment. As the first SUV rounded the curve, Reacher swerved the truck violently to the left, smashing into the lead vehicle. The impact sent the SUV spiraling off the road, crashing into the trees. Reacher didn't look back. One down. But the others were still on him. He needed to lose them, and fast. Reacher spotted a dirt road branching off into the woods. He yanked the wheel, taking the turn hard, the truck's tires skidding on the loose gravel. The dense forest closed in around him as he sped down the narrow path. Branches scraped against the windows, and the truck bounced over the uneven terrain, but Reacher kept it steady. The SUVs followed, their headlights cutting through the trees like predators closing in on their prey. But Reacher wasn't prey. He was the hunter. Up ahead, the dirt road ended abruptly at a steep hill. Reacher slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just before the edge. The SUVs weren't far behind, their engines roaring closer. Reacher jumped out of the truck and ran for the trees. He didn't need to outrun the SUVs. He just needed to outsmart them. As the first SUV barreled down the road, Reacher threw himself into the underbrush, disappearing into the shadows. The driver didn't see the end of the road until it was too late. The SUV crashed through the trees, tumbling down the hill in a violent roll. Reacher heard the crash, followed by silence. 2 down. The third SUV slowed, its driver more cautious now. Reacher crouched low, watching as the vehicle stopped near the edge of the road. The driver got out, gun in hand, scanning the trees. Reacher waited, his muscles coiled, ready to strike. When the man was close enough, Reacher moved. Fast and silent, he lunged from the shadows, grabbing the man by the throat and slamming him to the ground. The gun fell from his hand as Reacher pressed his knee into the man's chest. "Who sent you?" Reacher growled. The man gasped for air, his eyes wide with fear. "It's bigger than you think, Reacher. You can't run from this." Reacher's jaw tightened. "Watch me." He knocked the man out cold and stood up, glancing back at the wreckage below. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Want to know how Reacher takes on the mastermind behind this? Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe and share. Chapter 5. The Informant. Reacher stood over the unconscious man, his breathing steady, his mind racing. Whoever was after him wasn't playing by the usual rules. They had resources, coordination, and the guts to pull something like this in broad daylight. That told Reacher one thing: this was personal. Someone wanted him taken out, and they were willing to go all in to make it happen. He rifled through the man's pockets and found a phone. Basic model, burner style, the kind used to make calls that couldn't be traced back. Reacher flipped it open. One missed call. No number. Just the kind of anonymity Reacher expected from professionals. He pocketed the phone and turned back to the road. The other men were still down, 2 SUVs trashed beyond repair. It would take time before reinforcements arrived, but Reacher knew they'd come. They always did. He needed more information. He needed to get ahead of whoever was orchestrating this before they could regroup. And he knew exactly where to start. Back in town. Reacher walked through the woods, emerging a few miles away from where the trap had been set. The small town sat quietly under the setting sun, but Reacher knew better. Things were rarely as quiet as they seemed. The diner was still there, its neon sign flickering weakly. But Reacher's attention was elsewhere. Across the street, in a dilapidated building that once served as a hardware store, he saw movement. Someone was inside. Watching. Reacher crossed the street, moving silently toward the building. He didn't knock. He just pushed the door open and stepped inside. The place was dark, filled with dust and the smell of old wood, but in the corner, illuminated by the dim light of a flickering bulb, was the man he'd been looking for. The informant. He was thin, wiry, with a nervous twitch to his hands. His eyes darted up when Reacher entered, and he flinched, like a rabbit caught in a trap. "You're late," the man said, his voice shaking slightly. Reacher took a step forward, looming over him. "You were expecting me?" The man swallowed hard. "They said you'd come. After the trap." Reacher's eyes narrowed. "Who's they?" The man looked down, avoiding Reacher's gaze. I can't tell you that. They'll kill me." Reacher leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. "If you don't tell me, I'll make sure you never get the chance to worry about them." The man's hands shook as he fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. "Here," he said, thrusting it toward Reacher. "This is all I know." Reacher took the paper, unfolding it carefully. Written on it was a name. Edgar Lyle. Reacher didn't recognize the name, but the way the informant said it, he knew this man was important. Someone high up. Someone pulling the strings from the shadows. Who is he? Reacher asked. The informant shook his head. I don't know exactly. But he's big. Real big. He runs things from behind the scenes. Makes people disappear. If he's after you, you're already a dead man. Reacher looked down at the paper again, committing the name to memory. Where do I find him? The informant hesitated, fear etched into his features. You don't. You can't. People like Lyle, they don't get found. They find you. Reacher leaned in closer, his voice cold. I'm not people. Now tell me where. The man gulped, eyes wide with terror. There's a place. Outside of town. A warehouse. They say he operates out of there. But I wouldn't go if I were you. Reacher stepped back, slipping the paper into his pocket. Good thing you're not me. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the building. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. Night was falling, and with it, the danger was closing in. Reacher had a name. He had a location. But this was just the beginning. Whoever Edgar Lyle was, he'd made one big mistake. He was coming after Jack Reacher. And Reacher was coming for him. Are you ready for the showdown? Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe and share to see how Reacher takes on his most dangerous enemy yet. Chapter 6. The Warehouse. Reacher stood outside the warehouse on the edge of town. It was an industrial complex, long abandoned by the looks of it, with rusted metal siding and broken windows. No lights, no sign of life. But Reacher knew better. Lyle's operation didn't need a flashy headquarters. Places like this were perfect, isolated, forgotten, and easy to disappear from. Reacher approached cautiously, staying in the shadows. He'd done recon on places like this before, countless times. He could already see the weak points, the blind spots in security. But what he couldn't see was how many men Lyle had inside, or what kind of firepower they were packing. He circled the perimeter, spotting a side entrance partially concealed by a stack of old crates. Quietly, he slipped through, his senses on high alert. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the floor creaking under his boots. The warehouse stretched out in front of him, rows of crates and machinery cast long shadows under the dim moonlight. Reacher moved silently through the building, his eyes scanning for movement. He reached the center of the warehouse, where an open space had been cleared. And there, sitting at a makeshift desk under a single hanging bulb, was Edgar Lyle. Lyle didn't look like much. He was short, balding, with the look of a man who had spent most of his life behind a desk. But Reacher knew better than to underestimate him. Men like Lyle didn't survive in the shadows by being weak. Lyle looked up as Reacher approached, his eyes cold and calculating. He didn't flinch. He didn't even seem surprised. So, Lyle said, his voice smooth and even. You made it. Reacher didn't respond. He kept his eyes locked on Lyle, reading every movement, every twitch. He was looking for a tell, something that would give away the ambush he was sure was coming. Lyle smiled slightly. You're not much for small talk, are you? Reacher took another step forward. Why me? Lyle leaned back in his chair, as if considering the question. Why not you? You've made quite a name for yourself, Reacher. Men like you don't get to disappear. Sooner or later, someone comes looking. And when they do, well, let's just say there's a market for men like you. Reacher's eyes narrowed. A market? Lyle chuckled. You'd be surprised how many people are willing to pay to see a man like you brought down. You've stepped on a lot of toes over the years. Made some very powerful enemies. Reacher didn't care about enemies. He didn't care about the past. All he cared about was the present, and right now, the present was standing in front of him, smug and overconfident. Lyle leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. But it's too late now, Reacher. You're already in the game. And the game, well, the game doesn't end well for people like you. Reacher's jaw tightened. I don't play games. Lyle smirked. No, but you're in one now. And the rules are simple. You lose. Reacher didn't wait for more. In one fluid motion, he lunged forward, grabbing Lyle by the collar and slamming him against the desk. Where's the rest of your crew? Reacher demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Lyle gasped, his smug demeanor cracking. You think this is over? They're already coming. You're done, Reacher. But Reacher wasn't done. Not yet. He threw Lyle to the ground and looked around the warehouse, listening for the sound of approaching footsteps. Lyle wasn't bluffing. Reinforcements were coming. Reacher had to move. Fast. He grabbed a pipe from the floor, bracing himself for the coming fight. The door burst open, and a dozen armed men flooded into the warehouse. Reacher smiled grimly. It was time to finish this. The endgame is here. Subscribe and share to see how Reacher handles the final showdown. Chapter 7. The Final Stand. The warehouse echoed with the sound of heavy boots as the armed men poured in, their weapons drawn, their eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Reacher crouched behind a stack of crates, gripping the metal pipe in his hands. 12 men. They were well-armed, well-coordinated. But Reacher had one advantage: they didn't know exactly where he was. The men fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the dimly lit space, illuminating the dusty air in sharp beams. They moved with precision, covering every corner, every shadow. But Reacher had learned long ago that no matter how well-trained a team was, they all had weaknesses. And Reacher was very good at finding weaknesses. The first man passed by Reacher's hiding spot, his flashlight sweeping the floor. Reacher moved like a shadow, silent and lethal, slipping out from behind the crates and grabbing the man by the neck. Before he could even cry out, Reacher had him in a chokehold, squeezing until the man slumped unconscious. 11. Reacher dragged the body back into the shadows, taking the man's gun but leaving it behind. He didn't need it. The sound of gunfire would alert the others, and right now, he wanted the advantage of surprise. He crept forward, staying low as two more men moved through the aisles of crates. They were alert, but not alert enough. Reacher waited until they passed, then struck, slamming the pipe into the back of one man's head and driving his fist into the other's throat. Both went down without a sound. 9. The rest of the team was starting to realize something was wrong. The leader, a tall man with a military stance, barked orders, sending the remaining men deeper into the warehouse. They were coming together now, moving as a unit, but that only made them slower. Reacher used the darkness to his advantage, slipping between crates, stalking them like a predator. He took down two more in quick succession, a brutal combination of strikes that left them sprawled on the floor. They didn't know what hit them. 7. The leader finally caught on. Spread out. He's picking us off. But it was too late. Reacher was already in motion, his eyes cold and focused. He moved swiftly, disarming one man and using him as a human shield as the others fired in his direction. The bullets missed, ricocheting off the metal crates as Reacher advanced, closing the distance between him and the shooters. He threw the unconscious man aside and tackled the nearest gunman, disarming him with a swift twist of the wrist. A bone snapped and the man screamed, but Reacher was already moving on to the next. 5. The warehouse erupted into chaos as Reacher took down the remaining men with brutal efficiency. One by one, they fell, their carefully planned assault crumbling under the weight of Reacher's sheer force and skill. 3. The last two men tried to make a stand near the entrance, firing wildly as Reacher closed in. But panic had taken over, and their aim was sloppy. Reacher dodged the bullets easily, his body moving with the precision of a fighter who had been in more battles than he could count. He took down the second-to-last man with a sharp kick to the chest, sending him crashing into a stack of crates. The final man, the leader, backed away slowly, his gun trembling in his hands. You're a dead man, the leader stammered, his voice shaky. You can't take on everyone, Reacher. There's more coming. You'll never get out of here. Reacher stepped forward, his eyes locked on the leader. Maybe, but I'll take you down first. The leader raised his gun, but Reacher was faster. He slammed the pipe into the man's hand, sending the gun flying. The leader tried to fight back, but Reacher was relentless. A quick strike to the gut, followed by a brutal elbow to the jaw, and the leader crumpled to the ground. 1. Reacher stood over him, breathing hard but steady. The warehouse was silent now, the men lying unconscious or groaning in pain around him. The fight was over. But Reacher knew this wasn't the end. He turned to see Edgar Lyle, still lying where Reacher had left him, watching the entire fight with wide, fearful eyes. Lyle wasn't so smug anymore. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd made a very big mistake. Reacher walked over to him, his shadow looming over Lyle like a specter of doom. You wanted me? Reacher said, his voice low and dangerous. Now you've got me. Lyle swallowed hard, fear flickering in his eyes. Reacher, listen, we can work something out. I have money. Power. You don't want to kill me. I can make you rich. Reacher shook his head slowly. I don't want your money. Lyle tried to stand, but Reacher grabbed him by the collar, hauling him to his feet with ease. You should have left me alone. Lyle's eyes darted around, desperate. Please. Reacher, don't. Before he could finish, Reacher slammed him against the wall, knocking the air out of his lungs. He held him there for a moment, his grip tight, his expression cold. Who else is coming? Reacher demanded. Lyle coughed, struggling to catch his breath. No one important. I swear. Reacher let go, letting Lyle fall to the ground in a heap. You're lucky I don't kill people for sport. Lyle gasped, clutching his ribs. What are you going to do? Reacher glanced at the unconscious men scattered around the warehouse. I'm walking out of here. And you're going to tell everyone who sent you that if they come for me again, I won't be so generous. Lyle nodded frantically, too terrified to argue. Reacher walked out of the warehouse, the night air cool against his skin. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The message was clear, Jack Reacher wasn't someone to be hunted. As he disappeared into the darkness, the only sound was the quiet hum of crickets in the distance. Reacher had no destination, no plan. But that didn't matter. He was moving on. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.